Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. YB Professor Masami, the Chief Institute of Penang, Dr. Lim Wing, Board Member of Penang Institute, Mr. Tim Nicholas, Chief Operating Officer of Penang Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to everyone. Good evening and welcome to our second Malaysian lecture series. This evening, we are very pleased to invite Professor Quah, who is also a Penang boy, to come to share with us his views on the new global normal. Professor Quah is the Lee Shing Professor of Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University Singapore. He was previously an assistant professor at MIT, as well as an associate professor at London School of Economics. Professor Quah has many talents, and his current research interest lies in the economic approach to world order, global power shift, and the rise of the East, as well as models of global power relations. Professor Quah has many talents, as I say. He has studied previously at Princeton, Minnesota, and Harvard. And at this point, I'd like to share a short clip of Professor Quah of what his multi-talents are. So please share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tonight we are pleased to have the Deputy Chief Minister too of the Islamic State government to deliver the opening remarks. Kindly welcome Professor Dr. Ramasamy on stage for this.
Professor Quah, Lee Shing, Professor of Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, Dr. Lim Wah, the Chief Executive Officer and Head of Economics at Penang Institute, Dr. Lim Wing, member of the board of Penang Institute, Tim Nicholas, Chief Operating Officer of Penang Institute, and of course we have Dr. Brown. Surprise visit by Dr. Brown and his daughter of the B. Brown. If you don't know, B. Brown is a big establishment in Penang now, growing. And ladies and gentlemen, now as a board member of the Penang Institute, it gives me a great pleasure to be delivering this opening speech for the second Malaysian lecture series. This evening, we are hosting yet another Penang boy, Quah, who is now a professor at NUS. Professor Quah will be delivering a lecture on globalization and how this new global normal is no longer what it looks like anymore. Why is the world not so normal? Today we see many peculiar things which we would have never fathomed before. In Malaysia, we have food outlets that have been asked to rename hot dogs or refuse halal certifications by a government religious authority. Now they say they have no problem with the label, but the contents, the recent change. Globally, we have many countries adopting negative interest rates, meaning that you have to pay the bank to keep your money. Then we have Brexit that we showed a rejection by the British of the European project. In USA, we have Donald Trump, which to many people surprise is a Republican Party candidate for the president, although he might have divorced himself from the Republican Party DOB lately. This makes me wonder what is happening to the world. Penang and Malaysia have benefited enormously from globalization and from immigration, trade, and technological innovation. We were founded as a port by the British, and today we are an important node in the global supply chain. But we have seen some on the far left and far right embracing crude populism which can surprise many Malaysians. There is no doubt that the forces of globalization, immigration, and technology have taken hold globally. In Malaysia, we see that TransPacific Partnership Agreement has been pushed through by the federal government despite opposition from many parties, including my party. Some of our worry is driven by the fears that Malaysia has not got a good deal out of it. Nevertheless, the anti-immigrant, anti-globalization sentiment expressed by some today in other countries echoes lurches of the past. This does not bear any benefit, especially to Penang, which is very integrated globally, whether in our economy or in our society history. While it is easy to brush off this as an extremism, since it is happening in so many places in the world, it certainly warrants our attention. There is no doubt that some of the discontent is rooted in the legitimate concerns about long-term economic forces. Globally, we have seen decades of declining productivity growth and rising inequality have resulted in slower income growth for lower and middle-income families. Malaysia is deeply merged in the middle-income trap due to mismanagement and policies of the former government. What we have seen is that deindustrialization in the US has greatly helped Asia, including us in Penang. We must remember that the Intel's first overseas plant was in Penang. But as we uplift our economy, globalization and automation seems to have weakened the position of workers and the ability to secure a decent wage. Before this global financial crisis, we have seen too many potential physicists and engineers spend their careers shifting money around in the global financial markets and dabbling in the dubious financial instruments instead of applying their talents to innovating in the real economy. The recent fine by the US Department of Justice to Deutsche Bank of USD 14 billion shows the severity of the problem. In Malaysia, we have won one MDB scandal. Therefore, it is not surprising that so many people are accepting and agreeable to the argument that the game is rigged against them. For a diverse country like Malaysia, the rise of the Islamic State, this can be potentially a potent combination. Besides, amid this understandable frustration, much of it is spent by irresponsible politicians who actually make the problem worse rather than better. It is important to remember that capitalism has been the greatest driver of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known. There have been alternatives, but all seems to be worse than capitalism. Penang and Malaysia have benefited from this globalization wave. Without this, Penang's progress would not have been possible. The globalization and technological transformation that drives some of the anxiety behind our current political debate has in the past benefited Penang. However, there needs to be a clear recognition of the differences between globalization and the evil side of capitalism. Specifically, a capitalism shaped by the few and unaccountable to the many is a threat to all. Economies are more successful when we close the gap with the rich and poor and growth is broadly based. A world in which 1% of the society controls as much wealth as the other 99% will be never be food stable. Therefore, in Penang, we are proud that our Gini coefficient is around 0.364 in 2014 and which is lower than the Malaysia's Gini coefficient of 0.401. We believe that gaps between the rich and poor are not new, but in the poor, the smartphone can see how the most privileged live, expectations will rise. This will put pressure on governments to deliver, and a pervasive sense of injustice undermines people's faith in the system. Therefore, we need development that is capitalism, but socially inclusive. Without trust and support from society, capitalism and markets cannot continue to deliver the gains that they have delivered in the past centuries. The way we shape our economic model and society requires recognizing that Malaysia is a diverse and complicated country, so there needs to be a recognition that Malaysian ills such as rampant corruption, affirmative action policies that has been abused to benefit the selected few, brain drain, are holding the country back. Therefore, in restoring full faith in Malaysia's economy, where talented Malaysians such as Quah, who is with us today, should have been imparting his intellectual insight at the Malaysian universities instead of overseas, requires us to reshape some of the more difficult impediments to our progress, reforming our system to reverse the brain drain. Besides, to allow hardworking and talented Malaysians to progress, we need to address other structural challenges such as cleansing the government of corruption, boosting productivity growth, combating rising inequality, giving equal opportunities to talents who want a job can get one. With this, we can hope of building a more sustainable and resilient economy that is suited for future growth. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past few decades, Malaysia, Penang, and the world enjoyed fast productivity gains. However, productivity has slowed down across nearly all the countries. Set against these challenges, we have some incredible opportunities. Firstly, we have seen technological advances through internet, mobile devices, robotics, advanced materials, and how it affected the way we work. With these innovations have changed lives, they have not yet substantially boosted measured productivity growth. So one has to question, how can we achieve higher productivity? This is because without a faster growing economy, we will not be able to generate the wage gains the younger generation expects, regardless of how we cut up the economic pie. So the Penang government has been very active in enhancing our productivity potential. Policies focused on education are critical, both for increasing economic growth and for ensuring that it is broadly shared. These include everything from boosting funding for vocational training, to improving our roads, making our city more livable, and expanding our industrial parks. We have opened a new tech dome in Komta that is first of its kind in this region. We also set up the Penang Science Cafe. Even our scholarship scheme, the Penang Future Foundation, has a special focus on engineering, mathematics, and the sciences. The Penang State government is also funding the German dual vocational training scheme in Penang, such that apprentices need not pay a single cent, but instead will be receiving a stipend. The Penang State government is also cognizant to one of the impediments to productivity gain is a shortfall in infrastructure development. Perhaps due to our success and certainty due to inadequate investments in the past, Penang has become much more popular in the last 2 years and traffic congestion has worsened. This has put incredible strain on our road transport system. Therefore, the state government has proposed the RM 27 billion Penang Master Transport Plan to revamp and prepare Penang for the future. Secondly, alongside slowing productivity, inequality has risen in many countries. For example, in China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the Gini coefficients have increased from the 1980s and this decade. Contrast this with Penang, where inequality has fallen and is now below what is in Malaysia. This is possible in Penang and under the state government because we managed to turn around the economy and our state. We are used to be called Pulau Penang, Darul Sampah, and the state was dirty, not only in our physical state, but also in the Barisan National Government, the reigning then. In the 8 years we have taken over, we have managed to turn it around to be clean, and visitors are surprised by our physical state and even Transparency International praises for our clean governance. The fruits of our savings is then channeled towards social program, anti-poverty scheme, such as our 100 ringgit contribution to our senior citizens. Countries and economies are successful when we narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, and growth is broadly based. This is not just a moral argument, but a logical one, as concentrated wealth at the top means less of the broad-based consumer spending that drives market economies. Although the Penang State government initiatives have borne fruit, we do not rest on laurels. In Penang, our economy is balanced, the services sector contributing slightly more than the manufacturing sector, and we are striving to make it better. Thirdly, we need an economy where there are meaningful opportunities for work for everyone who wants a job. Penang is fortunate that the employment rate is recently hit 1.8%, a record low, and we have very few female labor force participation rate. This is an enviable figure to many countries, as involuntary joblessness takes on the toll on the person's life satisfaction, self-esteem, physical health, and mortality. So it drains the essence and spirit out of our society. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is entering an interesting phase. We have a taxi company that does not own any vehicles, valued at USD 70 billion. Then we are seeing the final phase of the US presidential race, where Donald Trump has surprised many to be even the race, and I hear the popularity is increasing. So indeed, what we normally expect do not seem to be the normal anymore. With this, I would like to welcome Professor Quah to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Members of the board, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and friends and former classmates from TransPacific. It is a great pleasure to be here. I left Penang far longer ago than I like to think. And I've been very grateful for the time that I did get to spend in Penang when I was here. What I want to talk about this evening, that you've been kind enough to let me speak on, is something about globalization. It's something about the world, it's something about how the world has changed, about the new normal. And it will be a story of how things have transformed in the world, not just over the last however many years since I last got to be here, but even more recent, in the last 10, 15 years. I think the world is moving through a very dangerous phase. There are dangers and risks from a number of fronts, some unexpected, some not so unexpected. So it's a story about something that's large. And for people in Penang, we can relate to these large stories. But perhaps there ought to be something more than just, these are things going on in the world, and they ought to be of interest to the 7.5 billion people that are on Earth. What's that something more? It's not good practice in general to give talks and then try and inject oneself, the speaker, into the talk. But I want to try and break that rule a little bit. I want to tell you about why these large things I'm talking about are especially interesting to me, a small town boy from Dato Praman, and why they're interesting to Penang. When I lived here, some dramatic transformations happened in the time that I was in primary school and secondary school. We had a chief minister named Chong Yu, who had a vision about transforming the state and the island. And he did some things that many of us did not understand or we did not fully agree with. One of the things he did was he went around knocking on doors of multinational corporations, what now we would think of as Silicon Valley. And he would convince these people to come and invest and build structures, provide jobs, create assembly lines here in Penang. And as a small boy, as you watch these things happening around you, there were some things you picked up on. Some people had livelihoods transformed. Kampong people, kampong boys and girls, whose economic opportunities might have taken one form, one trajectory, before all this happened, began to take another trajectory. And as schoolboys and schoolgirls growing up at that time, we couldn't help but notice the factory buses and the transformation in people's spending habits, the transformation in people's lives, that all of this was happening. And in that regard, Penang was actually different from many other parts of what we might now look back on with nostalgia as the emerging third world back then. Penang was outward looking. Penang, through the vision of one person and then carried forwards in different ways, whether we agreed it has been carried to successful fruition or not, it transformed our society. And as a small boy in the midst of all that, trying to learn geography, trying to memorize facts of history, none of this may have made any sense to me or to us, my classmates and I. We saw things transform, but that it was a manifestation of what later would become called globalization, and that Penang, together with Singapore and a few other places, were at the forefront of this wave of globalization, did not enter our minds. There was no reason it should have. We were interested, we were concerned with very bread and butter issues. I want to try and convince you that the things that were happening then with globalization were transformative for so much of the world. Changed the world. It didn't change just Penang. The same forces that were at work, foreign direct investment, engaging with the rest of the world, creating goods and services that you then exported in vast quantities to the rest of the world, yet that give you access to a market of billions of people, those same forces that I barely understood, I had no idea what was going on in Penang, transformed the world in the last 4 decades. It lifted 650 million people out of extreme poverty in China. More than 100% of the UN's Millennium Development Goals on poverty reduction came out of just that single country, that single transformative experience. And that happened for the same forces that were driving these changes that we saw around us in Penang. Same forces that were driving the changes that are going on in Singapore, where I live now. Singapore, Penang, parts of China, selected parts of the world were at the forefront of this wave of globalization. And it profoundly transformed all of our well-being. Some parts of the world more than others. It's helpful to us to understand why that happened. Why did it change some parts of the world more than others? Will this continue? Many economists who look at the last 70 years of world economic history say that trade, international trade in the world, the most extreme, obvious manifestation of globalization, grew 3 times what the world's incomes grew. So yes, 650 million people will lift out of poverty in China, but the world transformed much more dramatically from the flows of ideas, goods, and services around the world. And we were in the forefront of that. Never. Did we leverage that enough? The world's global supply chain, the world's international division of labor transformed. Did we in Penang situate ourselves in a position that we could exploit that? Singapore today that rode the same forces that we did in Penang. Singapore today has an average income that's higher than Americans. The level of infrastructure in Singapore today is the envy of Americans. Singapore relied on exactly the same forces that we could have done. When I read the obituaries of Lim Chong Yu, and I went back and tried to understand all these experiences, there were people who compared Lim Chong Yu with Lee Kuan Yew. They said that the same energies, the same uniqueness, the same determination, the same unique vision, no matter whether we agree now politically with what he did, the same transformative vision might have driven Penang. But many of us look around and we don't think of ourselves as comparable to those that have ridden the waves of globalization the best way that we could have. Why didn't we? Are we going to be in a position to do that now in the new norm as the world continues to transform? What are the forces, the challenges, the risks that you and I now need to leverage if we do want to leapfrog into these front ranks? And I think we do. And I think we can. So what are the risks and challenges? What do we need to do? I think there are 4 big risks in the world today. And whether we, Penang, whether we, the globalization hangers on in the emerging world, are able to leverage that, comes from our being able to navigate successfully these risks. I want to point to 4 large risks. There are many. In Q&A, or you yourself thinking about this tonight, later on, you will come up with your own list, but I think there are 4 that are very large ones that belong on everyone's list. But I don't want to suggest that the world is all just doom and gloom. So I want to conclude with 4 bright spots in the global economy, global economy. And whether you and I leverage these bright spots successfully will determine whether another however many years we get to see one another again, we will be able to say we have been successful. What are the 4 risks? I'm going to try and run through these quickly. This is an evening event. We're here to have a bit of fun. We're here to enjoy ourselves. It's not going to be a heavy-duty, depressing trawl through Machiavellian morasses, deep philosophies. There are not going to be equations that flash up here, regression statistical equations. We're here just to have a little bit of fun, enjoy ourselves, but be mindful of these 4 risks. So let me tell you what I think the 4 risks are. The first is the US presidential elections. And what do I mean by these risks? Well, right now, we've got 2 leading candidates that just had their last debates this day, 9 p.m. in Las Vegas, Nevada, or 9 a.m. here in GMT +8 in this time zone. And it was a depressing affair. You couldn't walk out of that room and think, okay, you know, we've got a new Harry Truman who's going to construct a world order that will bring us out of this terrible secular stagnation that we've all sat in since the 2008 global financial crisis, and for some of us in Asia, since the 1997 Asian financial crisis. What do these 2 candidates tell us? Well, Trump tells us he's going to make America great again. And when you think about what's wrong with Trump, you cannot stop thinking. Now there's a rule in making presentations that say you never put more than 6 words on a slide. I decided to break the rule for a good cause. Because when I started to write out what's wrong with Trump, people at the back of the room cannot see the list. But you know it's a long list. And it runs from personal characteristics and an awesome ability to consider himself the master of every domain, to think that his business acumen will allow him to put his fingers on nuclear weapons. He is racist, he is xenophobic, he is misogynist, he speaks badly of everybody who is different from himself. We don't know when to stop. Let me end with just one thing. And I think this is the real danger. Yes, he is one person. He could well become the president. But far more dangerous than any of his personal qualities, that he has opened a dialogue of hate in America. America was a wonderful democracy, and I used the past tense. Some of you in this room know me from before I left for the West to study as a university student. And I bought wholesale into the vision that America was a country that did good in the world. And what was good for America was good for the world. And that the vision of rugged individualism, the vision of unbounded individual liberties, of personal freedoms that America expressed was the right way to think about the world. That's no longer the America that exists today. What Donald Trump has done, whether he wins the election or not, he has opened an effective hate. In 1964, long before I actually went there, I'm not as old as you think I am, long before in 1964, Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican presidential candidate at the time, said in his right-wing way, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Words that today seem almost harmless. But at the time in 1964, Americans rose en masse to denounce what Barry Goldwater said as fascist, as not respecting what made America the welcoming society that it did. But you compare that with what Donald Trump does today. Donald Trump's narratives rely on 4 dimensions. First, there's an extreme nationalism. It's us against the world. China, Japan, and Mexico, they are making fools of us. They are winning. They are ripping us off. There is an appeal to fear and bigotry. People who are different from us, we will build a wall and we will prevent them from coming in. It creates a vision of America at the center of an unfriendly world. And he's not shy on drawing on humiliation as a way to energize his fellow Americans to vote for him. He talks about how we're losing because of the stupidity of our leadership. Everybody else is stupid. He will transform all of this. But the narrative is one of national humiliation. And finally, he and his followers show contempt for anyone who gets in their way. Now, interestingly, historians look at these 4 characteristics, say these are exactly the same 4 characteristics that drove Adolf Hitler, that drove Benito Mussolini. They have driven fascists throughout all of human history. This, what Donald Trump has done, has opened political cover so that white nationalists can talk openly about supremacy. It is a dangerous world that Donald Trump has opened for us. Now, many of us think, as an individual, he can be contained, he might become president, but when he becomes president, he's not going to be as flippant, as nonchalant about nuclear power. We don't know. But the scenario that has already happened is that he has opened an invective of hate in America. And that invective of hate has transformed political debate. Bernie Sanders, who was in the extreme side of him, has transformed the ground that Hillary Clinton is able to play in now. Even if Hillary Clinton is deeply unpopular, she remains a sensible candidate with deep experience, but her views on globalization have changed from the pressures from both sides, extreme right and left. She used to consider large trade partnerships. She wanted to build the gold standard of trade agreements, but she's backed off on all of that. America has changed. That's a huge danger to the world. This is an economy that's still the world's largest economy. The world has 40 aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers matter because they are the only way in which the military can project power. You can undermine a country through cyber hacking. You can destroy their defenses through intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the only way you project power in the world is through putting boots on the ground. The only way that you put boots on the ground is through aircraft carriers. The world has 40 of these aircraft carriers. America has 2/3 of them. America has overwhelming nuclear power. America is still the world's largest, most powerful economy, and it drives global growth and global trade. And that's going to no longer be the case, whoever becomes president. The world has transformed from being an open global economy that allowed these Bastilang to come around, transform the lives of kampong girls and boys, has allowed Singapore and China to leverage onto that the wonderful things that they have been able to do. All that's off the table. Well, I want to argue it's not entirely off the table, but it will no longer come from the usual sources. And that's a big change in the world. Brexit is the second big change. Now, there's some bread and butter issues. I was in London when Boris Johnson, who became a friendly face of Brexiteers, gave a talk to Malaysians like you and me. And he wanted to argue and tell Malaysians why he was arguing for Brexit, why Britain had to leave the European Union. And he said just this to this group of Malaysians. He said, Britain and the European Union constantly tells us what we must do. It tells us about the shape and size of potatoes and bananas. It tells us what kind of bedding we'll have. It's telling us everything we have to do. And he said, when you go home to Malaysia, imagine that Singapore every day tells you what to do. We're all laughing. This entire room of Malaysians all laughed. Everybody burst out into applause, gave him a standing ovation. Of course, Brexit was a good idea. Britain would no longer be pushed around by the Singapore of Europe, a bossy, kiasu, rich, technologically advanced trading bloc. Britain would have none of this. Britain would go its own way. And 17 million Britishers voted for exactly Brexit. A narrow majority, 53% of the total vote. And let me not pretend that all of it was just about this fear that Malaysia has against Singapore, or that Britain had against the ridiculous things that Brexit was suggesting. That the EU was telling Britain all these different things that it was not allowed to do. There were some bread and butter issues. There was the idea that with the migration of labor, the free flow of labor into Britain, Britain was losing control of its borders, Britain was congested, they were taking our jobs. Who were taking our jobs? Europeans were taking our jobs. Locals were displaced, public services had come under pressure, we couldn't keep up. 17 million Britishers bought that vision and they went into it. But that's not the only thing that happened with that vision. Just as we might think, in the United States, the argument is about who's got a better trade deal. Is China really beating America? The invective and the narrative became something quite different. And then emerged, once again, this invective of hate. This underlying view that it was us against them. And these things have happened. I mean, the United Nations has openly asked the conduct of British politicians in the run-up to the Brexit referendum has encouraged the racist, xenophobic atmosphere. Because the numbers simply suggest that the number of hate crimes that the Metropolitan Police in London recorded rose 42% in the 2 weeks before and after the referendum. In the last month, in the last week of July, a month after the referendum, hate crimes, crimes against foreigners, crimes against xenophobic, crimes that identify as xenophobic crimes, had risen 49%, and the numbers keep escalating. It is not just about joking that we as Malaysians don't want to be pushed around by Singaporeans. We in Britain don't want to be pushed around by the European Union. It opens an element that sits beneath all of us, and we need to be constantly struggling against. Polish workers have been beaten up. My colleagues in London, who look as English as one might imagine, they're Finnish, they're Greek, they're Italian, they're Western Europeans, are being spat upon and attacked because this invective of hate has emerged. The upshot from this is that the world has changed. The world political narrative in terms of the transatlantic axis is no longer about left and right. The real question for us, Brexit, the Brexiteers might say, well, we're closing off from Europe. That's because Europe was pushy and bossy against us. But what we've seen is the narrative has become us versus them. Us and Britain against the rest of the world. And while Britain still continues to carry the line that we are the world's most open nation, we for 200 years have pushed globalization, this wave that in Penang you and I benefited, Singapore grabbed leverage, that China used to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That might no longer be on the table. And we've moved into a world where the world's strongest, firmest, historically longest-serving democracies now engage in a post-factual narrative. Well, okay, that's a polite way of saying they tell lies. I encourage you to use that phrase as well. Every time you see a politician get up and say something that doesn't quite sit well, that politician has gone post-factual. The post-factual narrative that Trump and others articulate is not a problem for that part of the American population that supports them. Because the American population have grown disillusioned with the political system around them. Now, I don't want to belabor the point. I've given you two scare stories. What's going to happen in the United States in just a few weeks. And I've tried to suggest to you that actually, whoever gets into the White House, they will be president over a country that completely transformed. And that transformation is what you and I need to keep our eye on, not exactly who it is that's in the White House. And I've told you how Brexit has changed Britain. Historically, the world's most open country is no longer that. I mean, if these were things that for us in Penang we worry about with what we are trying to do, find our new place in an ever-shifting global supply chain as the world engages in different applications of information technology, robotics, as we try and navigate between services and manufacturing. We used to make more hard disks that went into Dell computers than any other part of the world. As that world changes, this closing off of the transatlantic domain is a huge shock to the world. And if that weren't enough, let me just very quickly go over some of these changes that we will have, that we will see forthcoming. Now, you might say, well, this is just democracy working its way through the system. We respect democracy. Well, some of the greatest thinkers in Western democracy actually didn't think that democracy, as it's being practiced now, was that great. Winston Churchill, who many people will remember, saying, yeah, democracy is the world's worst political system, except for all others that have been tried. We think that he's a huge supporter of democracy, and indeed he is. But he also said, the surest way to convince yourself of the faults in democracy is just to sit down for 5 minutes with the average voters. Mark Twain said that, if democracy could actually change anything, they would never allow us to vote. And H.L. Mencken said that democracy is a pathetic belief that you take a group of people who individually you wouldn't trust to give them the remote control to change the TV channel. And you think that all of this, by giving them the vote, out of that will come something sensible. Democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual leaders. Now, this is pretty dangerous political waters that we're going into. What exactly are we suggesting? And what we're suggesting is we need to rethink this system. Donald Trump has already said two things that could add to his collection of fascist statements. He has said that if he becomes president, Hillary Clinton better watch out because she might be put in jail. That's the kind of talk that the American journalists would jump on if anybody else in the rest of the world said, because that would be a banana republic. That would be a system whose democracy had failed. The second thing that Donald Trump said just this morning for us is that he said he might not accept the results of the US elections. Why is he? Well, we can joke about how democracy has all these problems. You and I are very happy we live in a democracy. You and I are sitting in a state where you and I, through the ballot box, have actually changed and transformed governments that we thought did not serve the people. One of the few places in the world generally that have been able to do that in a sensible way. That's what democracy does. Democracy encourages politicians, political leaders to struggle, compete as hard as possible, but then whether they win or lose, they accept the result and they walk away. When you lose, you do not reach for a gun. That's the wonder of democracy, despite all these negative things that have been said for it. And you know what? We're in danger of that now. And if the world's historically most profound democracies are in danger of that now, what's going to happen to the rest of us? What kind of political system are we navigating into? So, Trump, Brexit, These are surface manifestations of something much more profound that's troubling the world. I'm not going to spend time on two other great risks. I'm just going to point to the South China Sea because I'm depressing myself talking about this. But I want to get to the bright spot. So the South China Sea is obviously a huge issue. If you want to engage in the discussion, I'm very happy to do that. The problems in the South China Sea are, I think, not one-sided. It is not clear that China is the belligerent aggressor. It is not clear that China is going to lose from the judgment that's been made against it by a permanent court of arbitration. All of these things are on the table. But there's a bright spot here. And that bright spot is that for the longest time, for 40 years, China's engagement with the rest of the world has been not, we are good, try and be like us. It is, we can think about win-win outcomes. We can try and think about ways where both of us benefit. And that's a wonderful narrative that we need to continue to take forward. Let me leave you with the fourth great risk, and then I will turn to some brighter spots. Islamic State or Daesh. Now you might say, well, again, this is something that's happening way off. Why should it bother me? It bothers me personally because it profoundly attacks the system of beliefs, political and economic, that the world has successfully used to bring the 7 billion of us into the state that we're in now. Islamic State is now a caliphate. As of 2 years ago, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi ascended the pulpit and announced the formation of the caliphate, it transformed from being simply a movement to a nation. And it's a nation that has 4 characteristics. It rejects peace as a way of doing business. And all other nations abide by the opposite of that. Second, it is set on genocide. It has identified enemies. The Shia, Islamic democracies, all Western-style systems, all apostates, and it's targeted them for the worst, most brutal kind of killing. It is itself incapable of change, and even as right now, the attack on Mosul, the attempt to take back Mosul continues, where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared the caliphate. This is something that's expected by Daesh. Daesh argues that the end days will come after Dabiq, a small town that they've identified as the center for where the new world begins. That Dabiq will be taken by Western forces, which it already has yesterday. That as Mosul is overrun, the new savior will emerge and Daesh will be the active agent for apocalypse. Now, all of these things are not things we have seen for centuries. But it is a viable part of what the geopolitical discussion is going on out there. And it is very scary. It means for us that there are issues in international security, our trade and openness that has benefited so many of us is under threat. And systems, global systems are under attack. Now, the West has for a long time argued that it was the best system that worked. This idea that it is liberal democracy together with free market capitalism is the only political aspiration that unites regions and cultures around the world is a powerful narrative. It is the narrative that kept me in the United States, that kept me in the West. I know I said that it is invidious for people who give large lectures like this to start talking about themselves, and I've violated that rule at the beginning, I'm violating it now because it's something that has affected not just me, but has affected so many of the rest of us. We bought into this idea. We bought into this idea that this is the system that worked. And as these observers in the West looked around the rest of the world, they argued that the rest of the world didn't work. So let me end with the 4 bright spots. Because I want to argue that the rest of the world has worked. And the rest of the world has worked in ways that you and I need to be proud of, need to be optimistic about, and need to take forward as a potential new world order, as a potential new global leadership. And I want to, so that we remember what the 4 points are, I want to say that there's the small, there's the big, There's the many, and then there are the aware. So what's the small? Well, Singapore is the small. A fact that I already told you is that even as Singapore was criticized as being uncreative, as not having the right kind of trajectory for working its people too hard, as you and I in Malaysia look at them and say they're so kiasu, they couldn't follow, they couldn't be creative, they're only following rules. Look, the fact of the matter is that system, which so much of the rest of the world has been critical of, now is richer than the United States in per capita income. Obviously, it's just a country of 4 million people. It's not going to have a per capita total GDP that's larger than the US, but on an average level, it is now richer than the United States, the small. In terms of the large, well, China has risen. We all know that. China today is the world's second largest economy. By some account, purchasing power parity is already richer than the United States. It's already the world's largest economy. It has quite a bit of ways to go still on market exchange rates and nominal values. But the rise of China, or the rise of Asia generally, has transformed the world. And it's transformed the world while we were all quietly going about our business. Many investment bankers, many bankers, policymakers, politicians like to talk about, oh, the world has changed because the global center of gravity has changed. It has moved towards China. And as a practicing technical academic economist, I couldn't let that statement stand at just face value. I wanted to see if the world's economic center of gravity had really changed. So I went and I collected data on thousands of locations around the Earth. I tracked them over 30 years, and I calculated what everybody was talking about, the world's center of gravity. And to nobody's surprise, I found that the world's center of gravity in the 1980s sat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. To nobody's surprise, because the United States was the successful economy. Western Europe was a successful industrial powerhouse. There was some interesting activity in Japan, but obviously it wasn't large enough to pull the center of gravity away. And for decades, the world's economic center of gravity sat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But then something very profound transformed within our lifetimes. As we were all going about our business, the world's center of gravity stood up and walked away. It walked east. So in the last 30 years, the world's economic center of gravity, as calculated through this mechanical means, has moved from the center of the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula. Pulled by the rise of China, yes, but also the rise of you and me here in this part of the world, the rise of Asia. And while you and I might say, well, things aren't as exciting as in the United States, they've got neon things that go bang, they've got all nifty toys. The fact of the matter is, the world's center of gravity is on course towards us here. And within our lifetimes, before 2015 hits, it will, according to this projection, be in this time zone. World's economic center of gravity will be here. And whether you and I sit up and take notice, just as in the early 1970s, in Zhongyu, Lee Kuan Yew, Gok Keng Swee, Deng Xiaoping planned on transforming the world is being transformed towards us. And it's up to us to differentiate. The many. It used to be that the world center, yes, it sat in the Atlantic, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, because the world's richest economies were exactly that, the richest. And this gap between the world's richest economies, the G7, and 100 of the world's poorest economies, the emerging economies, that gap was so large, it was more than 2/3. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, throughout the 1990s, the gap between the hundreds of emerging economies taken GDP altogether and the G7 taken altogether was over 2/3 of what the the G7 GDP was. But you know what? That gap has gone away. The world's emerging economies have caught up. And for democratic legitimacy, we need to take charge. Now, there are many ways in which you can think about global democracy, and I've suggested earlier world democracy is under threat. But maybe world democracy has been construed too narrowly, and I want to end quickly with this. Because you see, if the world were a democracy, everyone would have a vote. That's the whole point of democracy. When the Greeks ran democracy and they said slaves and women and children couldn't vote, we, America, Britain, looked back on that and said, that's not democracy. Democracy is when you have universal suffrage. when everybody can vote. So let's extend universal suffrage to all of the world. And if you did that, how would the world vote? Where would it vote? America has 70 million people. Britain has 60 million. Where is the world's tightest collection of people? Where's the world's tightest simple democratic majority? I realized that actually we don't know the answer to that question, so I went and calculated it. And the results of that calculation is if you go to a point in eastern Myanmar, near this town of Mongkhet. So in this time zone, in GMT +8, and you draw a small circle around it, 3,300 kilometers in radius, it is this circle that contains the world's simple democratic majority. If we ever held elections for the world and we had to choose a world leader or a system of government or rules on trade, tariffs and taxes and how open societies would be, it is us who would decide this. I've given you 4 reasons why we should be cheerful. These are changes in the world that are profound, that we didn't expect. But the world is not there yet. And I would like to see a world where this I would like to see a world where this is not a joke. Okay. For those of you in the back of the room who might not be able to see this bag, which is being carried in the New York subway, says, it's obviously carried by a young Chinese woman. It says, "Marry me for Chinese citizenship." I'll tell you why the world is not here yet. When I lived in the United States, like all of us, I was struggling, what should I do? People told me, look, you're already in the United States. If you don't make it here, try and do everything you can to stay here. For God's sake, marry an American and stay here. If you need to, marry an American for citizenship. I would like to see a world, for all the reasons that we've described, moral decay that we've seen happening elsewhere in the world, the emergence of these vibrant new centers that are around us, that we need to write globalization, that I would like to see a world where all of us carry bags like this, and everyone will think it's not a joke. Whoever it is right up there, I'll go up and talk to her or him, and see if I can go there and make my living. The world is not there yet. And this picture that says, have you tried turning the United States off and on again to reboot it? Many of us still think that this is the way the world ought to work, even if this is a joke. And then the previous picture is even more of a joke. And I hope we move beyond that world. But what are the takeaways? I've tried to tell you about 4 things. I've told you about the risks that are in the new normal as promised. I've told you about why they matter to us. I've tried to tell you how they matter to us even when we didn't know it. When I first entered the Penang Free School in Form 1, and I saw the transformations that were happening in the factories, in the countryside, in the kampong, in the towns, in Georgetown, and we had no idea. My friends there, King Hit, Yao Chiang, Kok Soon, a bunch of us in this room. This was not something that impacted us, but it transformed the society around us, and we should have been able to leverage that more as other parts of the world did. And that globalization is going away. It's going away because the West has turned in on this. But then I've told you 4 things that make me cheerful, that every day make me get up and go to my office at the Lee Kuan Yew School and say, we can work on making things better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite our moderator on stage, Dr. Lim Kim Quah, to take some questions and answer. If you have a question, raise your hand and we will hand you a microphone. Then you can introduce yourself and keep your questions short. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, please.
bank here in Penang. My question is very short, it's a quick question. Professor Danny, I can add a fifth positive side. Global capital is footloose, and it's not going to be trapped in any country. So money is flowing around. What's your view on that?
We'll take 2 or 3 questions first. Just now I saw the gentleman at the back, please.
Sam Chin, originally from Penang, Singapore. Just a question on your lecture, Jen, right? That something has changed in the world, and it doesn't look good. Now, my question is it possible that actually nothing has changed in the world? That all the racists, bigots, the crazy people who want to do mass shootings, and the terrorists, they all exist, or have always existed. But there's just this one element, the internet, which has brought them all together. And whether you think that the solution to this, if that is the case, right, that all these people who are crazies and nuts are all managing to plot to destroy the world now, whether it could be solved by simply banning the internet.
Thank you for both questions. I know there are some hands up still, so I'll try and be brief in my answers. On the question about global capitalism being footloose, so in a sense that's a suggestion that, well, let's not worry overly, because global capitalism doesn't find a productive, friendly home where it can be profitable, it can create jobs, it can continue to advance technology forwards. If it doesn't find a home in where it traditionally used to reside, don't worry, go find it somewhere else. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think that, and there's a lot of truth to the good that capitalism brings. But at the same time, there's also an important emerging narrative in the world that totally unbridled capitalism gives rise to the kind of monopolistic, exploitative dynamic that's excluding huge chunks of humanity that, throughout the 70s, even as America practiced a form of rugged individualism, unbounded liberties, free market capitalism throughout the 1970s. The 25 years in the run-up to 1995, 50% of the American workforce actually suffered absolute declines in their income. It wasn't just that inequality was high and getting higher, it was that the bottom 50% of the population got poorer on an absolute scale. And we see as we go around the world and we think about how China has opened up its markets, it does its best to try and keep in check the worst ravages of free market capitalism. For goodness sake, it's still a socialist economy, but inequality in China is higher than it is everywhere else in the world, except the most extreme free market version. So I think whether that's good or not, let me not try and pronounce on, but let me suggest that politically, a system like that cannot be sustained. A system that does not offer enough of an inclusiveness to at least 50% of the population will not be sustained in a political system that gives voice to everyone. And we need to take this in moderation, we need to take this in measure. And perhaps the rest of the world will now enter this new age of rebooted capitalism in their own neighborhoods with greater trepidation, with greater circumspection, and will be more careful about letting the worst ravages emerge, and that would probably be a good thing. On Sam's really interesting question, let me repeat that. He suggests that while I've talked about some of these very large changes in the world that on the one hand are scary, but then on the other hand also bright, well, he wants us to consider a narrative that says the world actually hasn't changed. And that comes down to how human nature itself is a miserable thing. And that we humans have been kept in check for the last 100, 150 years, except for the outbreak of World War I and World War II. But for the most part, when the world has been at peace, we have been able to keep ourselves in check through whatever institutional structures we built. And Sam rather mischievously suggests that perhaps the internet is bringing down all these obstacles. I feel I would be uneasy agreeing with you, except for the very first part that says that there's a sense in which the 7 million years that humanity has been on this planet, we have not done ourselves proud. If aliens ever, were monitoring us, they'd be shaking their heads. They'd be saying, what exactly have we unleashed? But you know what? Out of all that craziness, we also built wonderful political systems to keep this underlying animal human nature in check. As long ago as 1600, Thomas Hobbes wrote about how in the state of nature, the life of man would be nasty, brutish, and short. But out of that grew a political philosophy that gave rise to the nation states that we see in the West. It gave rise to the American Constitution, the American Declaration of Independence, the idea that individuals could come together and build something that was sustainable. Very wonderful, beautiful things. And these ideas, these big ideas went out to the rest of the world, and we built an amazing humanity from that. I'm loath to let that go. And I'm loath to suggest that humanity is not able to control this, but we rely on our political leaders to carve out the space for us to engage in these transactions. And we've got political leaders who are drawing on the worst, meanest, lowest instincts that we have within us. Let's call a spade a spade. They are the ones to blame. Political leaders, not just in the West, but in our country here, draw on the worst instincts and set one part of society against another. Let's not let them get away with it.
Gentlemen, please.
Thank you for an excellent talk. But maybe to provoke a little bit, I would say you really highlighted some symptoms rather than causes. And if I go through your arguments, I mean, the real causes really stems from technology changes, information technology that was already brought up, and of course from trade, leaving large parts, certainly in the US, Europe, and elsewhere, struggling with people struggling with things to do and find new ways of living lives. And I don't think you addressed those issues in any way, and maybe it is very, very difficult to actually tackle them, but those are really the real causes and the real risks that we are facing as we go forward, in my mind.
Right, I saw a gentleman in the back.
My name is Quah. Good evening, Professor Danny Quah. I'm a bit apprehensive as to the advancement of the computer world, and then making many of us, jobless. And I'm sure when you went over to the States in the 70s, would it be right to say when Elizabeth Warren said that during that time there was a big middle class in the United States, and now there is such a wide gap between the ultra-rich and the ordinary people. And I seem to see that it hasn't changed from a capitalist sort of environment to a socialist environment in China, where people are now extremely rich, and the rest, very small portion, are just middle class and majority, still very poor in China. I would like to hear your opinion or your suggestion as regards what Piketty, who wrote in his Change, where that 300 or 400 years in Europe and America, when there was the extremely rich and extremely poor, the slaves, the patricians and the plebeians, so-called, the ultra landowner and the workers, the slaves. What is the difference between now when we have such a gap between the rich and the poor? Thank you very much.
Perhaps I can get a question at the back. The lady, please.
Hi, my name is Xiao. I'm a student currently abroad, originally from Penang, but currently studying abroad. I have a question on methodology. I mean, you've sort of characterized these terms in quite sort of couched in moral values, you know, what's good, what's bad. I'm just wondering how this kind of affects your thinking, how this has affected your philosophy thus far.
Okay. Thank you for all these questions. Let me do these in turn. The gentleman in front, I apologize, I don't know your name. He suggested that because my analysis, because the things that I looked at were not really fundamental causes, but they were just symptoms and effects of something else that's going on beneath the surface. And many people who think about some of these underlying causes, they look at technology, or they look at globalization and trade, or they look at just some systemic part of the system, some systemic part of capitalism or the way markets work. It's true that I fully I plead guilty to the charge of not sticking to the fundamental causes, but there's a reason I do that. And the reason I do that is because the fundamental causes will, in my view, the ones that matter, the ones that are relevant for this discussion, come with both good things and bad things. And there's a danger that when you, in the course of discussing the fundamental causes, in a situation where you're trying to understand the risks, one doesn't give enough space and time to the good things that technology and trade allow. So, focusing on just the causes, one ends up saying, well, some good things will happen and some bad things will happen. But the point about how the bad things the reason that I follow the strategy that I do is because I feel that the bad things can all be repaired. The good things we need to continue. We should not be trying to shut off technology. We should not be trying to shut off trade, even if they allow these kinds of things to emerge. But we need to manage. And to figure out how to manage them is not to understand how the underlying causes are. Let me take the underlying causes as given, but to understand how the bad manifestation or the unpleasant or undesirable manifestations emerge. This my language leads quite easily into the last two questions. There was first a question about, well, with the extent of inequality that we see in the world, shouldn't there be much more despair? How are we exactly going to manage this very large changes that are transforming the world across many different systems? And so maybe there the underlying causes don't matter, because whatever the cause might be, everything seems to be going to hell as far as inequality is concerned. I don't think that that's true. I think that inequality comes with trade-offs, and as the world moves through different phases of technology, globalization, political understanding, the nature of those trade-offs change. I don't think that the world would be perfect if we eliminated all inequality. I don't think you, the gentleman who asked the question, would either. And there's a middle ground between the kind of rampant inequality that we see today and where we think inequality is justified, inequality is sustainable. It's trying to get at the nature of that trade-off that I myself try to do. This gets me to the last question, which is my discussion here this evening. It's almost like black and white, this is something good, that's something bad. And I think that in terms of the things that we're talking about here, it is fair, it is right and appropriate that we call these things good, that we call certain other things evil. Now, this doesn't mean that I think that the whole world is black and white. I think that there's a lot of nuance, and as we unpack an understanding of why people continue to support Donald Trump, many of them are my good friends, many of them I agree with, and that little Taekwondo clip that you saw at the beginning, many of the people I fight with in Taekwondo, that I spar, are exactly people who voted for Brexit. It was in my great incentive to try and understand their thinking. I don't think of them as evil, but I do think that the outcome of what has happened, the invective of hate, is unambiguously a bad thing to have happened. And I think that I'm comfortable carrying forward that good and bad accusation through all that I've said. But again, I accept your point that nuance is important, and I hope that in my other writings I do apply that nuance. But here, there's good and evil, and we might as well call it that. All right?
Can we have the gentleman, please? The front.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Guru. I have two questions. I will make it short because the time is short. Now, firstly, I noticed that when we talk about new normal, we read a lot about the globe going to experience very slow economic growth in the years to come. And there is a feeling of hopelessness because even with many central banks engaging in quantitative easing, negative interest rates and all that, there does not seem to be much of an uptick in growth. That is my first question. The second thing related to growth is also that probably one of the fundamental causes of all the problems that we are seeing is that we are all too obsessed with growth. Now the basic question is, given that the global resources are limited, should we be pursuing so much growth? See, they normally say, if you talk about food production, there's enough food for everybody, but the distribution is not fair. Similarly, perhaps we should come up with a new model where we don't chase after growth, because man's needs are unlimited. You can never have enough. So perhaps we should concentrate more on sustainability and distribution. Thank you.
Right, can we have Sir in front? Yes, please.
I need to say, I just want to ask you, because you've talked about the axis of open versus closed. Unfortunately, our statesman has left, but he was saying that, or he was rather proud that the party was anti-TPPA. I just want to hear your view. You've talked about the small. We are the small's neighbor. So what's your view in terms of TPPA and how it benefits the small's neighbor? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. On the first two questions, the first question had to do with what I think of the new normal where the world economy is growing more slowly. And then interestingly, your second question, of course, is the opposite of that. Might it not be a good thing that the world is growing slowly? Let me take these in turn. This is a very interesting juxtaposition of ideas. The new normal that I wanted to talk about this evening includes the idea that the world might be undergoing secular stagnation. That in a secular, long-run trend sense, the world is stagnating. Exactly as you say, the instruments that we use to drive growth are no longer effective. Moreover, the one instrument that we've got that remains, trade, we are intentionally ourselves shutting off. So is the world resigned to this secular stagnation idea? I think there's a real risk of that. I think there's a real risk why that the world has grown more slowly is overall comes from a combination of different things that actually, if we unpack, we then don't feel necessarily so pessimistic about. It's true that the European economy as a whole is still growing extremely slowly, if at all. Many parts of Europe have not recovered their levels of income from before the global financial crisis. So it's going to be 10 years, and it's going to be a lost decade. China's growth is slowing, partly for the reasons of structural adjustment within it, but partly because it's now a more mature economy. And although when we say China's economy is slowing, we need to be very careful how we say that. The latest figures are that growth over the last 9 months has been 6.7%. But even if over the year they turn in 6.5%, 6.5% on an economy today that is a dozen times larger than it was just a few years ago, is going to be far greater addition to world GDP, far greater market opportunity than double-digit growth 10 years ago. So there's still a lot of good growth going on, but no question in terms of the raw numbers, there's a slowdown in growth. America has actually been growing rather healthily. Throughout all of this political uncertainty, America's growth rate has been robust. Yes, some people might say the jobs we're generating are not as good, some people might say wages are stagnating, but it's certainly been generating growth. So I don't think of the world, even if it is slower growing than it used to, even if some of these risks are self-inflicted, I don't think of the world as necessarily as fragile as one might think when we hear new normal and secular stagnation. On your second point, what kind of growth, is growth going to be a good thing? After all, we know that as growth happens, we continue to emit carbon. As the carbon footprint rises, we're in danger of breaching the protocols that have been agreed on for the world's carbon emissions, and that's going to break the 2 degrees Celsius barrier as compared to 2050. Profound changes in the world's climate and therefore the world's economy as a result of this. Natural resources are being used up, and don't we after all have enough? If we just take what the world has produced and we just spread it around, wouldn't we all be happy? I think there's an element of truth in all of these risks, all of these challenges, but the fact is there are still huge chunks of humanity that are poor, that are dirt poor, and if we took everything that the world had and we divided it among the entire world, do you know how much income we would have? We probably have about $15 a day to spend. And for those of us who are used to the kind of lifestyles that we do have now, that is not something we will be able to tolerate. So the world does have a problem in terms of distribution, but it's not going to be solved simply through redistribution. And it's easy to think about growth as being a more integrated, holistic, more comprehensive kind of measure. The growth that you and I would object to, and I readily agree with you, is the growth that comes from crude measures of gross domestic product, how much incomes people generate, without taking into account externalities, what we're doing to the environment, and all of that stuff. But you know what? It's easy to take those into account. We can't do that, can't do that with 100% accuracy. It's not clear what taking into account polluting the world means in 100% accuracy, but there are corrections we can make. And after we agree on those corrections, we would still want growth. That's the bottom line. On Senglee's question, which is very specific about TPP, I think the TPP is a good trade deal. I think it would be a terrible trade deal if it shut off China's engagement with the world, which it threatens to do because the TPP explicitly excludes the world's 2 billion people economies. The TPP is probably quite a bit stronger, and this might be why the state government here has fought this. It might be a little bit stronger in terms of intellectual property rights protection, in terms of investor-state dispute settlements that seems to, in many people's views, tilt the playing field in favor of rich multinational corporations and against emerging state governments. It's probably an attempt by many elements of the US business community to, as they say, level the playing field, but actually imposing tighter labor standards, tighter labor protections, which in the abstract, who could object to? But the reality of it is what that will do is make many of the businesses in this part of the world uncompetitive. It'll put a lot of small and medium enterprises out of business. Governments need to be able to take that into account. It will tilt the playing field in favor of American businesses. There are trade-offs in all this. Having more trade is a wonderful thing, but not if it shuts out chunks of China and India, which it's going to threaten to do. Having good trade is a wonderful thing, except if it intentionally makes your small and medium enterprises uncompetitive. So I think depending on where you sit, there might be a good reason why the statesman who's just left says that he's very proud that they fought that, just as there are good reasons why the country as a whole would have gone into a TPP-aligned bloc. I think it's a measure, there's a fine balance.
Perhaps some questions from the back. The lady in the back.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My name is Alexis. I'm actually from the small country, Singapore. So so what I really want to ask is that you actually mentioned distributing, you get $15 per person. But I know that there's some Scandinavian countries that actually toying with the idea of the universal basic income, like a hybrid system where you get some money and then after that they will earn whatever they will have from their jobs. But how would that actually affect your research? Because the basis of your research is quite rooted in study of capitalism and history.
Right. The other question just next to the lady at the back.
Hi, Danny. Welcome back to Penang, fellow freedom. My question is regarding corporate, multinational corporates. They are getting more and more powerful. Their revenue and their profits are even bigger than some of the GDPs of countries around the world. And that's obviously putting a lot of pressure on countries trying to gather. Where do you see this? How can countries rein in? And what we're seeing in terms of closing of the border, is that a result of that? And secondly, if you look at the world debt today, it's very high, especially among the first world countries like Europe, Japan, and the United States. Where do you see the end of it? How are we going to wean ourselves out of this billion of money? Thanks.
Thank you for both those questions. On the first, I consider myself partly Singaporean, of course, since that's where I live. And, it's a state whose rules I follow every day. So I'm completely with you. Don't go back and tell the government what I said about how Malaysians respond to Singapore. Your comment about Scandinavian states experimenting with systems of what we might think of as an even more progressive social democracy. It is spot on. They're doing exactly that. And there's a question why the rest of the world doesn't follow. And I think you're waving for some reason. Oh, okay. Different hand signals, all right. Okay. And I do hope that other countries try and experiment with these different alternative systems. It doesn't solve the problem, however, of global inequality. And I don't think of myself as simply studying models of capitalism, but I am guilty of the charge of studying actors around the world in terms of nation states rather than individual people. In a way, that's kind of belied by my picture of the world's largest cluster, where I didn't look at countries, but I just looked at people. But certainly in terms of my research in geopolitics, international relations, economies, I think about nation states. Now, the question that I carry in my mind as I think about the challenges that you've raised, which I have tried to worry about, and what I do is the following. Why is it that politicians and well-meaning people, well-meaning political observers who are extremely willing to consider a greater egalitarianism for their own country, why is it that that sentiment ends at that country's borders? If you're really interested in creating more egalitarian systems, you should be thinking about egalitarianism across the 7.5 billion people on Earth. not just the 9 million people who live in Sweden. So you should be thinking about extending a model of egalitarianism and greater equality to the vast swaths of China where people still survive on less than $1 a day, to the 400 million people in India who live on less than $1 a day. Why does this liberalism and this thirst for equality end at an artificial boundary defined by the nation state? It is precisely for worrying about that I carry on my research and I try and think about the questions that you raise in the way that I do. Because here's the fact. The largest single reason why inequality in the world is so high is because inequality across nation states is so high. Inequality is high in the world not because inequality is high in China. Inequality is high in Sweden and can be repaired. Inequality in the world is high because the average level of income in Sweden is so much higher than the average income in Papua New Guinea. And it's trying to equalize the world's collection of nation states that, in my view, will do the greatest good for egalitarianism in the world. Our feelings about equality should not end at our nation's boundaries. On the second question, about the worries about the world in terms of collection of multinationals, the power that they have, you're absolutely right. Multinationals are in many instances larger than entire countries. But we want to be careful how we take that comparison. Beijing as a city is bigger than Malaysia. There are cities in the world that are bigger than 75% of the world's countries. So the comparison needs to be careful and it needs to take into account specific circumstances happening around the world. Where I will agree with you readily is that the concentration in the world is increasing. If you look at the world's 5 largest banks, 30 years ago, they controlled some fraction of the world's banking reserves. Today, the world's 5 largest banks control a far higher fraction of the world's banking resources. And it's that concentration that is the real change in the world, not just that multinationals and different things are larger than entire countries.
I'm quite cognizant to the time, and perhaps we'll go for the last round of questions. Yes, sir, please.
Danny, you come from Dato Krama. I wonder, do you remember our favorite Hokkien saying, Gong Wa Bo Bun Ji? What I'm trying to say is talking doesn't require capital. My next 2 questions might require you to invest some capital. You see, obviously, globalization is on trial across the world. Would you like to play the role of a prosecutor, a defendant, or you just want to sit on the fence? My second question is, and you have to be careful here, I understand there are ears and eyes and ears here around the hall. If you were the Chief Minister of Penang, how would you engage globalization? Thank you.
Right, perhaps another question? Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm calling from Penang Institute, and I was free also class of 2009. Doctor, I want to know your political views, specifically on the role of government. And is there an alternative model to the capitalism/neoliberalism development model? Because as you pointed out, several problems in UK and US are results of people who have been left out of the development model from this development model because they feel disfranchised, disenchanted. And in Penang, you see, the free market leads to speculations. Property prices are out of people's reach. So, do you see an alternative development model, and what is the role of the state to facilitate that?
So, should we have the last question, please?
Now, if I'm not mistaken,
the TPPA actually tilts the balance in favor of the multinationals, more so American multinationals. Why is Trump so against it?
Okay, thank you for those questions. Perhaps this time I'll take them in reverse order. Why is Trump against TPPA? Trump is against trade deals generally. If he's president, there's a good chance that he will tear up NAFTA, which has been a huge success for both Mexico and the United States. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, has actually resulted in a complete transformation of Mexico from a very close single-party state to one with a greater thriving political conversation. More Mexicans have left the United States than have entered the United States since NAFTA came into place. It's inconsistent with his fears about Mexicans are flooding in and we have to build a wall to keep them out. Trump is not necessarily a fan of consistency, but one way in which he is consistent is that he's against trade deals generally. So there's a good chance that he'll march into the World Trade Organization and then he'll stamp his feet and then march out, taking the United States out of this architecture that has been hugely successful for the world. So I don't think that we would delve very hard into Trump's rejection of TPP. It's part of his visceral reaction that this is something that the elites have put up. This is something that Trump, and his followers don't necessarily understand and want to get into great details on, but it smells wrong, and so it doesn't bother him that it's inconsistent with some of his other announcements. So that would be my guess. But you know what? If he becomes president, we should ask him. On Suki's question, if I'll jump to Suki's question, then I'll come back on the Penang Institute question. Suki, of course, had two questions. And in the interest of fairness, I'm going to answer only one of them. If I were to stand up in court, would I attack, defend globalization? Am I being too nuanced in my presentation of what globalization has done? My answer to that is unambiguous. I would defend globalization. Globalization has completely transformed the world positively. As in my answer to the gentleman in front a few minutes ago, but like many other things that are as large and as dynamic, it's pulled along in its wake some very unpleasant effects. Labor displacement is not something that we've been able to treat properly. Economists have for too long talked about how globalization trade would be good for everyone, and yes, it has been good for everyone, except for those people who've been thrown out of jobs, who have been unable to find another one, who've been unable to transition to different industries, and for whom government infrastructure, national infrastructures have not been in place to allow them to do that. They need help, and if they can get that help, then once again we can bring globalization back to the central position that it ought to occupy. But on balance, on net, there's been a huge win for the world, that the world has become more open, it's globalized the way it has, and it's traded so much more. Okay, I'll take a stab at your second question as well. So, if I were a political leader of a representative, relatively small state, I would not think that I could go it alone. I would look to try and build coalitions and partnerships and alliances with others who are similarly minded. I would try and build a group that could potentially write the rules for a new leadership structure in the world. I wouldn't try and flail about and change things that I couldn't. But I would try and see where my ideas and where my instincts tell me to go, and I would go find other people, other countries, other states around the world that are in a similar position, and there are many. I would build a movement. That's what I would do. On the final question, the Penang Institute question, what is the appropriate role of the state? And it will not be clear, I think, from the things I've said or the answers that I've given, whether I'm a total free marketeer, whether I think complete state control is the right answer. And that's a fair picture, that's an accurate picture. I think there are many things that free markets do extremely well, and it is not a good idea for governments to get into them. But there are many other things that economists and politicians and ordinary people might think of as public goods, national infrastructure, transportation, a good school system, secure and stable business environment, the feeling that my country is not a corrupt country, that the things that foreign investors will find appealing, the political stability, the predictability, the welcoming business environment, all of those things are public goods, they're things that free markets don't solve very well, and there's a huge role for the state to move into that space. Now sometimes there's a long history that's unfortunate that contrasts the state and the market, and the margin between state and market is drawn in a politically motivated way. I think that maybe it's time we change the language. The things that what we used to think of as the state doing to provide all this national infrastructure, stable environment, schooling, that's enlightened collective action. That's something that all of us want. The state is not our enemy, it's providing that enlightened collective action. And I think the role of, if you want to use the language, role of the state is to think through what that enlightened collective action is, do things that free markets can't do, and I've given you a whole list of what those things are.
Right, I think we have a very interesting and wonderful discussion tonight. Please join me in thanking Professor Danny Quah.
Because we have a small token of appreciation, we would like to present to Professor himself. But can I have Dr. Lin to help me present the gift from the Penang Institute? Mr. Quah, the National President of Samantha, to present his gift. Thank you, Mr. Quah. Can I also have Mr. Quah, please remain. Let's have a group photo. Come on, Mr. Shing. Smile at the camera. The person in green. Let's be official. Alright, thank you very much. Thank you for staying with us.